I kind of got into some ideas about the relationship between the kind of the geopolitical and what the kind of the work that the geo does when we talk about the geopolitical, and the relationship to the biopolitical that people were talking about this morning. So, and this partly relates to a point that Claudia made in relation to one of the papers this morning, which was some of the kind of the slippage that goes on when the biopolitical starts to be talking not just about kind of conduct, but about life and about sort of all sorts of biological life. So what I'm talking about really is some of the implications of talking about the geo in geological, or the geo in the kind of the geologic term that's come up. So I'm going to say some things which are probably a little bit kind of big and abstract, and towards the end I'll start sort of steering back towards some of the questions that I probably should have started with. Part of this is really around the issue of, we've talked a little bit about, where does the political lie, and where are we when we're theorising. I'm also interested in the point about kind of when are we, and particularly when are we in geological time, or when are we in the time of the Earth. So really what I want to do today is just going to put a few ideas together about different ways of thinking about borders and thresholds. So one set of borders and thresholds are the sort that we tend to think about when we're talking about kind of politics, and particularly talking about biopolitics. This sense of crossing or coming up against a kind of a national border, and how this also, there's a kind of a parallel between this with the borders of certain sorts of bodies and how we define a body. The other sort of border or threshold being a border or threshold in a physical system, in an ecosystem or an earth system. Those two have borders or thresholds over which we find ourselves passing. And really what I want to talk about is just this sense of how why I think that the climate-induced migrant has become in some respects a kind of a symptomatic figure in contemporary politics, is because of the way they bring into relief this collision between two different kinds of borders or two different kinds of thresholds. So if we think back to Hannah Arendt, talking, just after World War II, we talked about the person without papers, without citizenship, without a home, emerging as the most symptomatic group in contemporary politics. So I just want to kind of play with the idea that perhaps the climate-induced migrant, for however hard it is to define this figure, I think precisely it's the undecidability which makes the figure of the climate-induced migrant so kind of interesting and significant and challenging, because I think politics actually revolves around that undecidability. If there wasn't that undecidability, it would be a matter of kind of calculation rather than a matter of ethics and politics. Okay, so if we're thinking about the sense of the kind of the biopolitical, and the sense of the being or the potentiality of humans as kind of living beings in a sense. And this idea that this brings you up against this whole sense of the immunitary or the auto-immunitary logic of the modern state. So in a sense, the potentialities, the different possibilities within humans as kind of biological beings, constantly coming up against the kind of the limits, the defining boundaries of the state. And this being, in a sense, I guess, one of the key kind of political, ethical issues of the 20th century. Think about all the kind of the different kind of aspects of globalization, and Arun very, very kind of helpfully kind of introduced my take on this. This idea that globalization has so far been a kind of a discourse of social scientists, which mostly involves moving across the surface of the planet, moving across the surface of the Earth, and the crucial kind of boundaries or transitional points being those sort of boundaries of territory. So it's really kind of like a horizontal process. So if we think of kind of an awful lot of social science over the last few decades, dealing with the kind of the problems of globalization, then think about kind of biopolitical discourses really over kind of most of the long 20th century, again kind of dealing with these issues of territoriality, and the kind of the implications of this for how we conceive of bodies. Okay, then think about really what's happened in the earth sciences over the last sort of 50 or 60 years. And really in the earth sciences there's been almost like kind of a series of revolutions, really about thinking about the earth as a single kind of integrated entity. So while in the social sciences we've been talking about kind of globalization, talking about the earth as this place which has become integrated and interconnected, in the physical sciences, the natural sciences, they've also been doing this kind of version of it. So the earth has emerged as this sort of entity, a single kind of unified entity, which has kind of multiple states, multiple systems. Okay, so really the idea that the planet has these kind of multiple states. If we think about climate science over the last 2 or 3 decades, really sort of building up our sense of the earth systems having multiple states through which they pass. So the only reason why human beings can have an impact, or any other kind of driving force can have an impact on global climate, is because the climate itself has multiple states. So if it wasn't already capable of shifting between multiple states, we couldn't just kind of nudge it from one state to another. And I kind of like the shorthand for this has become the tipping point, the idea that we can nudge global climate over a tipping point. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is just to, what I'm suggesting is that one of the reasons why the whole kind of figure of the climate-induced migrant has become, or is becoming, so kind of pivotal, is because they, in a sense, fall at the convergence of these two different kind of senses of a transitional point. They come at the convergence of the sense of borders, state borders, being places of transition, being kind of places of threshold, and the idea that the planet itself has transitional points, series of points across which you pass, and the fact that passing over these points is kind of deeply significant. So I think that one way or another, how we understand the climate change migrant is to do with how we understand this kind of convergence between the threshold, the border, in these kind of two sets of discourses, one in the physical sciences and one in the social sciences. Another way of looking at this is again thinking of the difference between kind of the problematic of territory and the problematic of strata. Some of you who kind of come from a bit of a Deleuzean background will have this kind of sense of the kind of Deleuze-Guattarian kind of notion of strata. But this sense that the earth is itself layered, it's made up of these different kind of layers of consistency. The notion of the Anthropocene that's kind of has become a way of kind of bringing all this into kind of relief. This idea that the earth passes through various sorts of stages, and this involves the kind of the layers of the earth passing from one stage to the next. So it's not just a matter of climate, it's also a matter about all different sorts of kind of earth processes. So in a sense, I think what the kind of the debate around climate change has kind of grown into now, this debate about have we passed out of the era, the epoch of the Holocene, into this kind of new era of the Anthropocene. That's really, it's kind of like a moment of kind of de-stratification, of passing through to layers or strata. So in a sense, in a way, I think that the climate-induced migrant is at once a figure who is caught up in transformations in time, transformations in the temporality of the Earth, colliding with movements across the Earth's surface. So I think that's for me why I think one of the reasons why, even though there may not be huge numbers of actually empirical climate change refugees yet, why they form such, I think, such kind of an intense kind of problematization of most of what we know of as the political. Because I think in a certain sense, deep time is erupting into the political in a way that it possibly hasn't done before. And it's now something that the whole idea of going over a tipping point, it's no longer just something which is a possible thing on the horizon. I think more and more we're actually living with the fact that we will go over one or more tipping points in Earth systems. We may actually have already started to go over those tipping points. So that sense of, it's not just where is the politics, it's the question of when is the politics. How do we deal politically with this question about an Earth which has multiple states and passes between states, and this perhaps kind of overburdened figure of the environment-induced migrant or the climate-induced migrant is, I think, caught up in all this. This raises all sorts of questions about planetary stewardship, Earth system governmentality, global Earth system governance. I think all ways of kind of grappling with this problem of how we bring the deep temporality of the Earth to bear on real, live, contemporary political issues, or the fact that this is going to happen anyway, whether we like it or not. So now really that in a sense is kind of like my intro, and it's kind of like, well, where do we go from here with this sort of slightly, I guess, grandiose way of thinking about the figure, the symptomatic figure of the climate-induced refugee or migrant. Okay, so what I'm starting to think with this is how might we see this already emerging as a figure in what I'm kind of talking about geopolitics, not just in the sense of the old style of geopolitics, great games played by big political forces across the surface of the Earth, but geopolitics in the sense of politics as if the geo actually did something in the same way that the bio does something in biopolitics. So in the sense that the bio and biopolitics is a force of something, a transition, a force of potentiality. What would geopolitics look like if the geo was itself seen as this kind of force of potentiality? I think we can see now in a number of ways that the geopolitical, and I think this actually exceeds, it both builds on and needs to learn from discourses of the biopolitical, but also I think it exceeds discourses of the biopolitical. I think we can see all kinds of things about kind of various sort of races for resources. Okay, the Arctic ice is retreating, so various nation states are trying to make claim on the resources beneath the Arctic. We're seeing where people have talked about sort of various kinds of financial instruments, insurance, futures markets, ways of, in a sense, kind of capitalising on the geopolitical as a kind of an event or a set of forces. For me, I think that perhaps one of the most kind of symptomatic sets of processes where I think these kind of geopolitical issues are beginning to, in a kind of slightly enigmatic way, whether they're beginning to kind of gather force, is really around the issue of land grabbing in various ways. So we think of land grabbing as being a kind of a shorthand for various ways that both state and private interests are attempting to corner or get a hold of certain resources, generally in kind of other parts of the world. And why, for me, the land grabbing issue is sort of crucial is that I think it's not just, it's in part, it's a kind of a repeat of the various sorts of kind of imperial kind of tracking and tracing and trying to get hold of and trying to corner and channel resources that we've been seeing for several centuries. But I think there's also something to me that is kind of new about it, which belongs to this era of being aware of the Earth passing over passing from one different state to another. This kind of awareness that we are already going through kind of threshold shift. So for me, one of the ways of understanding the process of land grabbing is to say that it's not just about securing access to territory or the resources under that territory. It's about, in a sense, securing access to or building a kind of building a space in which we can respond to these sort of transformations in Earth systems. So in a sense, it's a way of responding to the potentiality of the Earth. It's not just about responding to or trying to get your hands on what is already there. It's about having a space in which you can move if the Earth transforms, if it moves from one system to another. So that if the rainfall is here rather than there, if there's a shift in availability so that the water that was once here is no longer here, then the more land that you can, in some senses, have some kind of control over, the more chance you've got of actually kind of responding effectively to these kind of transformations in Earth systems. So for me, one of the things that's happening when we look at the whole kind of process of land grabbing is that I think we begin to see this sense of various actors who are more or less aware of the fact that the Earth can pass through different kind of systemic states, more or less aware of the kind of the imminence of these threshold shifts, beginning to operate across the Earth's surface in a way that kind of at once deals with territory, but also in a sense kind of deals with strata. So this is starting to kind of bring me towards back to the question of race and what this means for thinking through race. And really this is why I'm kind of glad it's a workshop rather than like a proper paper presentation, because I kind of reached this point and then I'm not quite sure where it goes from here. So I'm interested in the notion that the borderlands where climate-induced migrants, where we're imagining that these problems are going to manifest themselves and are going to be kind of fought out. The sense that the borderlands themselves are being kind of thickened in a way. They're being kind of stretched, and that countries become kind of buffer zones. In a sense, what I'm trying to do is almost kind of tip that horizontal process onto upend it, so that we also think about this as being a kind of a vertical process, so that those thickened borders also become thickened borders in the time of the Earth. So what we're doing is also, as well as we kind of thicken these borders on the Earth's surface, we're also starting to thicken these borders between the transitional states of the Earth. Certain powerful actors are trying to find ways to, in a sense, begin to colonize the borders around, or the thresholds around transitions in Earth systems. Some of you will realise the sort of bits and pieces of Deleuze and Guattari kind of thrown in there. The nomad, the state as the sort of the powers of the sedentary. So I just want to suggest that this is, as far as the actual kind of reimagining of race and what might happen to race, or what might happen to the imagining and the thinking of the kind of the differentiation of human bodies and the potentiality of human bodies. For me, this is kind of pulling in two quite different directions. One thing I think it does, and I think that this has already kind of come up in the conversation a bit already, that there are now a lot of kind of different fracture points in the relationship between different populations and what this might mean for the imagining of race. So we see that a lot of the forces in say land grab are no longer like necessarily the usual suspects. They're the more powerful oil-rich Middle Eastern nations, particularly making advances or contact with the less wealthy, less oil-rich kind of Islamic nations. So there's a kind of a movement that way. There's the movement, of course, of China into other parts of Asia and especially into Africa. Brazil, moving particularly across the rest of South America. So in a sense, what might be the kind of the racial kind of flashpoints, I think, are kind of, in a sense, kind of dispersing away from some of the kind of the expected, the usual kind of flashpoints. And what this might actually mean when we really start to bring in this notion of going over thresholds in Earth systems, I'm really not quite sure. That's a kind of like a very open question for me. The other way I have been kind of looking at this a little bit goes in a very, very different direction. And that is that the more that the idea of the Earth, and an Earth with deep time, an Earth that passes through and across thresholds, the more that becomes a political, cultural issue, I think the more it is that we begin to think human differentiation through deep time. So what we're finding is that at the same time as the Anthropocene is becoming a kind of an issue, at the same time that climate change has become an issue, there has been a lot more thinking about the kind of the deep past of the human species, and a kind of a multiplication of different kind of humans that we have been part of, we have interrelated with. Catherine Newsoft's been doing some great work on this. She's got a paper called Geologic Life coming out, where she talks about the kind of the issues in the present around the kind of the geologic, and how this is turning us back to the past to, in a sense, reinterrogate our relationship as Homo sapiens with these various human others. Just one thing to think about is that for probably 99.5% of the time that we have been of the genus Homo, that we have been around on the planet, there have been other members of the genus Homo. We have shared the planet with other humans. So it's really only the last sort of, perhaps as short as the last 10,000-12,000 years now that we've discovered Homo floresiensis. Hobbits, yeah. So in a sense, there's one of the things that the issue of the Earth going through these kind of transformations is that we're thinking more and more in terms of the other human species with whom we shared the planet at certain stages, and all the various kind of sharing of genetic matter, the various kind of exchanges that we have with these other species. So, in a sense, that's pulling racial imaginaries, I think, in a very, very different direction. There's the kind of the complication around the various kind of moves and land grabs, which I think is kind of perturbing, transforming the sense of how we imagine race in a time of kind of planetary transformation. Going in a very, very different direction is this sense of rethinking the deep human past. How these two different kind of pressures or draws or provocations to think the human and to think great, how they might meet. Again, I've got no idea. I think they kind of feel like they're pulling in two different directions. But one thing I think is really interesting is the sense that I know that Andrew's been talking a lot about the kind of the future conditional. But the more that we think about climate change in the present, I think the more that we are kind of provoked to think about the fact that the climate change in the past made us into the species that we are. So again, we end up going back to the whole question of the various times that hominids left Africa and the fact that the role of climate in those migrations. So I think there's possibly some really interesting connections in the importance of the way that particularly the Chinese imagine human ancestrality, the way they tend to think about the relationship between themselves as a kind of population and the deep past of humankind. I think there's some really interesting kind of flashpoints, fault lines, perhaps particularly in the kind of the conversations they're having with various African populations. I think that there's perhaps some questions there about emergent racial imaginations that again is not something I know about, but it would be something that I'm kind of interested in. So just to wind up, really I think that there's some kind of crucial flashpoints happening. And I think that how we imagine the climate-induced migrant is in a way, I think, fragmenting and fracturing racial imaginaries almost at the same time as it's kind of bringing together some kind of older and more familiar imaginaries. And I think that those imaginaries are being kind of fractured and fragmented both by this driving back in time to rethink human difference through tens of thousands, if not kind of millions of years, and at the same time working across these kind of new fault lines, which is what happens in the present as different actors try and kind of negotiate with and colonize the kind of the boundaries in the earth. So I think that some of the really important places to kind of look for emerging racial imaginaries are around this kind of emergent geopolitics, partly where people collide with kind of nation-state borders, but particularly where there's a convergence or a collision between nation-state borders and kind of the borders in Earth time. So I think I've probably raised a whole lot more questions than I've resolved. But this is kind of what the theme of the workshop has kind of provoked. So a kind of an open-ended sort of set of questions about really the collisions between two different sets of borders and thresholds. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.